Black magic is the worst enjoyable experience I've ever had. A 1 in a million idea that can only happen by complete accident. It's a game that Roblox never deserved. It was a soup of ideas from many developers that created one of the most technical fighting games of all time. A lot of people might remember it as just another class-based arena fighter on Roblox, but it's so much more than that. Today, however, the game has 0 active players. But it wasn't always like this. I mean, at some point it had thousands of players and was even on the front page of Roblox. So what happened? Well, the game I just showed you isn't actually Black Magic. It's a re-released version of the original game. We'd have to go way back. Like, way back. August 2009. KO released and started work on his game called Black Magic. At first, Black Magic was just like any other game on Roblox. Clunky, hard to look at, and the code held together by sticks. The premise of the game was interesting, however. A 3D arena fighter that is entirely physics-based. Additionally, all the weapons were uniquely coded from many different developers. Or even stolen. Half the time how the weapons worked was ambiguous, which is something that would definitely not fly in video games today, but it created experimentation and curiosity. So a player might get hooked on experimenting with these mysterious weapons and they start going through the massive roster looking for something that really catches their eye. And the class they would usually end up with would be something like Beast or Sentry, and for the time these classes look pretty damn cool. Taking this class they just learned, they go and hit the closest player. And in Black Magic, there's nothing to protect you from these beatdowns. And that's the biggest problem that plagues arena fighters on Roblox. There's nothing that protects the newer players from the more experienced players. Fighting games alleviate the problem of their difficult level of entry with tutorials, skill-based matchmaking. But in Black Magic, you're just dropped in with 124 classes that are all coded differently that you have to figure out all on your own. Not to mention, this might be the most unbalanced roster of all time. Some classes actively stun themselves while others are practically the third coming of Jesus Christ. And even if you could figure out a few classes, the game revolves so heavily on matchups that the class you perceived as good can be completely washed by a class you thought was bad. And as the player base gets smaller, the chances of you coming across a player that is experienced becomes way more likely. This is why everything I just described wasn't as big of a problem early on in Black Magic's lifetime. Back then, the gap between more experienced players and new players was much smaller. And most importantly, the game didn't have a lot of depth that would allow a player to separate themselves from the casual player.
Woo! That was sick!
But then, one man would change everything. NAZO would create a new line of weapons called an Enma, or more accurately, a keystroke class. These classes were like nothing else on Roblox. A typical class only had on average 4 moves, but these classes had tons. With endless tools, they danced around their opponents with blinding speed. Their movement seemed unstoppable, and the skill needed to properly wield one felt infinite. They completely flipped the game upside down. NAZO left his mark on the platform forever. But it wouldn't change the game overnight. Only as the player base dissected these weapons more and more over the years did the game really see drastic changes and even controversy. But that's for later. So how did these weapons work? And why are they the most hated and loved thing in Black Magic? First, these classes didn't operate like anything else on Roblox. It operated under the same principles that traditional fighting games do, even taking direct inspiration from them. To do a special attack in a fighting game, it's usually a motion input followed up by a punch or a kick button. In Black Magic, this would look like a series of motion inputs with an ender, usually being Z, X, C, Q, or E. This is called a keystroke, the core fundamental in playing a keystroke class. A player has to memorize a whole bunch of these sequences, which almost seems too much to ask. I mean, looking at all this, it almost looks like another language, but it's actually pretty easy. It's as easy as typing out this sentence would be for most people. Black Magic has no quarter circles or whatever this is. It's the exact same as typing out the word cat. The problem isn't memorizing the moves or executing them a couple times. The window to input a keystroke is tiny, but it's generous enough for a new player to do even the hardest inputs in a couple tries. The issue is, most people, including me, aren't used to slamming their keyboard. So after a couple minutes we get tired and take a break. Thankfully, keystroking is similar to other disciplines. The more you do it, the longer you can last and the more you can handle. It's why players spend hours playing almost daily because the improvement is so visibly obvious. They'll drop less inputs, be able to play for longer, and be more consistent. Even if they aren't improving as a whole, they are building a more solid mechanical foundation, and that feels great. Oddly though, a class would hardly have a single button input like a punch or a kick. Instead, a move list would only consist of special moves. And even if a class had a punch or a kick button, they were useless most of the time. So how would you even fight with only special moves? In games like Street Fighter, removing blocking, punching, and everything that isn't a special move would look very silly. The game would be frustrating to play for newcomers whose fights would boil down to who can do motion inputs better, and the game would be a competitive joke. But, as I mentioned before, Black Magic has no comparisons. In a 3D space, the defensive options of Black Magic are the special moves. The special moves are your dodges, your blocks, your reversals, and everything else. To keep it simple for now, let's look at Sax, or by its move name Tyrant Revolver. You may have noticed this is the same move as the one Soul uses in Guilty Gear, but it couldn't be more different. In Guilty Gear Strive, for example, Bandit Revolver is a confirm and some other things. It serves its purpose within the game. In Black Magic, Tyrant Revolver functions as a dodge, combo breaker, air-to-air, confirm, combo tool, air stalling tool, counter, combo starter, dragon surfing tool, cancel extender, and probably some other things I forgot to mention. This must be the god move or something. But no, it's just a move. In a 3D space, every move's functions matter in order to, well, function in a real fight. The moves that are lacking in these functions are never used. Although each move has a lot of uses and hardly has a single core purpose, these moves are incredibly different from each other. Sometimes they cover certain angles better, have unique properties, or are prominent in certain matchups. The defense is already built into the moves. Obviously, this is not something that would work in pretty much any other fighting game outside of Roblox. So yeah, all of this is cool to know, but it still doesn't solve the issue of beginner fights from looking like this.
This is all I got.
So what does Black Magic do to solve this? Nothing. There's no tutorials, sometimes no move list, and even worse, sometimes hidden keystrokes that were game-changing. This naturally led to frustration, confusion, and even worse, gatekeeping. All the problems Black Magic had were made way worse with the introduction of keystroke classes. These classes were incredibly unbalanced, made people more toxic and elitist, and were more confusing than anything else. But the game was doing better than ever and only kept growing. None of this made sense. How could keystroking, a single idea, keep an outdated sandbox fighting game afloat, competing on the front page of Roblox with so many issues to its name? Well, it wasn't the keystroke classes that kept thousands of players invested. Black Magic had a little thing called unlockables. Ever heard of it? These unlockable classes looked sick, but had kill requirements, so you had to grind the game to get them. And for the player base of Roblox, there were mice caught in the cheese trap. Secondly, the game was still very simple. Anybody could get involved and perform well. There was also still the feeling of a chance you could do something even if you were getting cooked by someone way more experienced. Today, it's very different, but that's for later. These things alone are pretty darn good to hold a player base. Replayability, unlockables, and a pretty generous skill gap where anyone can get involved. There was something for everyone to enjoy, whether it be doing something dumb or taking the game more seriously. But there's one last thing the game had to truly take a spot on the front page. Black Magic took advantage of the most successful aspect of Roblox: chatting. Well, not exactly. Let me explain. Roblox has had multiplayer solved for years. Every game you join is just a glorified chat room with a game attached to it. With the additions of voice chat and other features, Roblox has been leaning more heavily into it. This is why strictly single-player games tend to fail on Roblox and why bad horror games still fill your feed. I could go more in detail, but there's already a ton of videos complaining about the state of Roblox and the missed potential for developers to make genuinely great games. A friend of mine summed it up best. Like, dude, if Roblox wasn't just a cash grab and actual adults hopped on it for the good games, maybe in 20 years. The point of this being, it's very easy to get things done in Roblox, and Black Magic capitalized. It was a chat room attached to a sandbox arena fighting game which allowed for a great multiplayer experience. It's why if you go back in time and see some photos of me in Black Magic, it's mostly just pictures of me having some dumb fun with strangers on the internet. It's just a silly game with a lot of things to do, and that's fun. It's why the game managed to get a consistent player base daily and reach the front page. However, Blackmagic took it a step further, taking advantage of something community related called factions. In Blackmagic, there are 3 main factions a player can align themselves with: power, purity, and corruption. They all have some relation to the lore. Anyways, these factions all had cosmetics and groups where you could rank up in and also level up your cosmetics. Each faction had weapons aligned to them, usually matching a certain aesthetic. This added to weapon choice and loyalty, which is just a part of the cool factor. Saying you main something like Ravager or Berserker in Blackmagic was cold. Trust me, it was cool at the time. Unfortunately, Blackmagic's position on the front page wouldn't last long, and would slowly go back into the triple digits. The game had one big issue though, that would prevent it from seeing these numbers ever again.
It looks pretty cool. It was a lot cooler back then, bro. Because these look like really old effects now. Because this is really old Roblox.
It was outdated. Despite having some of the best effects on Roblox for its time, now everything looked dated and buggy, and as time passed, it would only keep getting more outdated with Roblox as a platform constantly improving and other developers getting better. This poor sandbox fighting game held together by sticks and stones had it rough now, and the solution would seem obvious to some of you by now. Updates. Well, the game wouldn't get any substantial updates for a very long time. And when it did, they came so infrequently that it practically did nothing to counteract the aging of the game. Despite having so many things to do in this game, it was just too hard to keep retention over other Roblox games. But finally, the game would have its first big hyped update. With the player count at the time hovering around the 400 range, a developer by the user Osama would bless Blackmagic with unleashed versions of the 4 iconic keystroke classes. They strive to be stronger, more modern versions of these classes. These effects, even though they don't look great today, were still way better than their older selves. There was a lot of hype surrounding their release, and rumors about the classes were constantly discussed on every server. These classes would be locked behind a 100 player kill requirement with a respective version of the older class to unlock them. People grinded to get the new and shiny class of their choice, and the player count did bounce back a tiny bit. In the first couple of days, it was rare to see these classes, but as the weeks progressed, more and more people had owned at least one unleashed class. Something was very noticeable though. A pretty big issue that you just can't ignore. These classes were incredibly overpowered and buggy. Bugs were par for the course in old Blackmagic, but being so unapologetically overpowered was a whole different problem. Most of them had access to instant kill moves, and all of them had very high damage moves. They were easy to abuse and just had very unfair playstyles, specifically Anoru. The unleashed classes were quickly recalled and Osama would face backlash. And this would mark a very unfortunate trend for Blackmagic developers. A very shitty community. Blackmagic players have a tendency to not put their criticism in the nicest way. A future Blackmagic developer will go on to say the most challenging part of working on the game was the community, and it isn't a joke or exaggeration. These people were ruthless about the Roblox fighting game. Salutations, Blackmagic developer. That recent update you made, I don't really like. Here's your IP address. Obviously, it is very discouraging to work on the game when you're working with people like this. One good thing though was the game was starting to be pushed further by its loyal players. The first thing to really get going was canceling. One of the oldest known techs in Blackmagic, but it wasn't brought to its full potential until years later. Around this time, canceling would start to gain traction even among the casual players. How a class gets started canceling though is very complicated, and every class does it in a weird and unique way. Usually if you do a move in Blackmagic, you're forbidden from using other moves for its duration. Canceling is essentially breaking that rule by using a move during another move. By doing this, you create 2 timelines of moves. On this neat timeline, you can see when a move starts and ends. If you continue overlapping moves on top of each other and timing it so the 2 timelines continue existing, well, you get a cancel string, or a cancel loop, depending on what recipe of keystrokes you use. This allows for some really crazy stuff, sometimes useful and other times useless. There's a great video made by a Blackmagic YouTuber explaining canceling from start to finish if you are interested in learning more about it. As I mentioned before, canceling would become a fundamental in playing some keystroke classes and the gameplay would start to look very different. As cool as this super fun and explorative tech is, it wasn't helping the game's main issues though. Blackmagic was still outdated, there was still a lack of updates, and interest in the game was just naturally waning. If your game is getting players hopping on and saying, "Hey, I remember playing this game, I feel so nostalgic," it is not a good look. Blackmagic only continued on its slow downward trend as time passed. Roblox and other developers continued improving while Blackmagic was stuck in the past. There was nothing going on. And the game would finally sit at around 100 players, pretty much irrelevant. And for some people, this is where Blackmagic died. Blackmagic would start to have frequent shutdowns, and among them, 2 brand new keystroke classes were introduced that would help the game's dying player base a bit. But the game would still end up shutting down one last time forever. The final shutdown happened with Roblox's filtering enabled update. For those of you that don't know, Roblox had a pretty big exploiter problem.
The Bluetooth device is connected successfully.
The 2018 filtering enabled update was a mandatory update that made it much harder for exploiters to not just do whatever they want in a game. Blackmagic always had issues with exploiters just messing with entire servers, and this update would solve it. Problem is, the filtering enabled update would also completely break the game. And for those of you who were around for this Roblox update, you would know Blackmagic wasn't the only game completely broken by it. Dozens of beloved games were broken by the filtering enabled update and would leave them in the past with their old code never to be played again. It was possible to fix Blackmagic, but KO wasn't up for the task. It was a lot of work with hardly any reward. It was better for him and many other developers to move on to new things and develop new stuff instead. And this is where the original Blackmagic lies to this day. Speaking of developing new stuff, the sequel Blackmagic 2 would be open to the public in late 2019, but let's not talk about that. Years and years went by and everyone had moved on to play other games, and a lot of them went to go play Blackmagic 2. But a few people were simply different. Namely, Lyric would create a keystroke-focused revival of Blackmagic titled Blackmagic The Legend Returns. It was positively received, but it wasn't a true revival of Blackmagic and didn't see a big player count. Although for Lyric and Blackmagic, a true revival of Blackmagic would finally emerge. This revival would be headed by Nylium, and it was essentially just Blackmagic 1. Nylium would also collaborate with a good Blackmagic player and developer, huge NAZO. Expectedly though, the revived Blackmagic 1 would not see any big numbers either. But that wasn't really important. Blackmagic was back, and had a lot of promise in the form of actual updates. Nylium and NAZO would work hard to bring their ideas to life, despite Roblox not having Team Create at the time. And they definitely served. With actually good updates, you'd expect the game to gather a following. But the game had become something of a coin mill game, which is a Korean term for a dead game that has been solved by the existing player base, but as a result, new players can't solve it. It's used to describe games with a ton of depth, or a huge barrier in mechanical execution due to the player base. If words don't paint a good picture, I got a couple of my friends who are also top players to try and replicate this cancel string. Only one of them sat through and learned it. The point being, despite having years upon years of experience, the game is still not easy. Now imagine if you didn't have these years of experience. Well, unfortunately, in today's Blackmagic 1, you're expected to know tech. That's the new standard. So is the game completely inaccessible for new players? Well, not really, and even some top players would say otherwise, saying the game can be easily caught up on. But we've only had one new player break the mold, a single exception. I'm not here to make conjecture on how big the skill gap in Blackmagic is today, but I know one thing for sure. The game had evolved. Nile and NAZO's Blackmagic revival had gathered a cult following of loyal players that were constantly pushing the game to its limits. At certain points in time, it felt like there was new tech being discovered every single day. Despite having dozens of hours in this game, I can't even say I know a fraction of what's possible. Even the more simpler keystroke classes were rich with tech. For example, Berserker. Dragon surfing or summon hopping was using your summon as a platform. And this looks like a math equation, but trust me, the tech isn't that complicated. This opened up some avenues like fighting or flinging off the dragon head, but it was mostly used for running. A lot of running actually. Like fighting below the map kind of running. Then on the opposite side of the spectrum you had Osama Samurai. This class was so ridiculously complicated, there's no way in hell someone as dumb as me can explain it, so I got someone else to do it. I could kind of argue it was the hardest class because it had over 500 different techs. Issue was, there was too much stuff in SAM to ever be used optimally entirely. This class exists so far outside of human comprehension that the only way we could compete with each other on it was finding shortcuts. It took a lot of theory crafting, hours in the lab, and hours of dueling to develop an identity on the class that would be easier on your hands and more violent for your opponent. Not a single person played the class the same. Finding shortcuts and consistency was a part of the learning process. Anybody could sit down in training with the class for a couple hours and develop something that had never been discovered or used before. But it was up to them to gather the tools that resonated with them best. It wasn't just Osama Samurai though. Everyone had found a class they absolutely adored and played it like it was a full-time job, cause the depth was there to dive right in. Nylium and NAZO's Blackmagic had accidentally created a beautiful thing. It was like walking into a tropical forest with all the things that were now possible. But something was bothering the small and loyal player base of Blackmagic. Balancing. The topic of balancing is without a doubt Blackmagic's most heated discussion. I mean, there are more than 100 classes. How do you even begin to balance them? Everyone had their own vision of how they wanted the game to be balanced. And well, NAZO tried to hear everyone out. He was a man of the people and he was actually really good at the game. And credit to NAZO because he did make the best out of a bad situation and worked towards finding a middle ground that unfortunately does not exist. In his own words, it's just always going to be two sides directly contradicting one another. But before I move on, I need to seriously give background on the climate in Blackmagic Unleashed before stuff really hit the fan. Around this time, the game would actually start seeing a decent player count with 30-some people active daily, just grinding the game, trying to improve, or labbing something cool. It was a great time to be playing Blackmagic, but there were still a lot of calls to action to balance the clearly unfair things present in the game. So the first thing to receive balance was Great Tender, the easiest keystroke to play, but it also had one of the most unfair playstyles. And it's very strange to call this update a balance change because all it did was just make the class a buggy, unplayable mess. So Great Tender was just pseudo removed from the game. Next on the docket was none other than Osama Samurai, a class that was very unfair and confusing to fight against if you had no prior experience. It could fling itself across the map or kite you endlessly. It was just not an honorable class to use. But changing this class would be the catalyst to Blackmagic's downfall. A large portion of the existing player base either mained Samurai or were invested in what the class had to offer. So NAZO cooked up a really solid idea that was met with little resistance. A complete rework of the class into a modern and brand new Samurai. There were some complaints of having the old Osama Samurai being removed and not just being kept in the game, but it was mostly pretty quiet because there would be a cool and shiny new class to use that just overshadowed the concern. The rework was positively received and Blackmagic got 40-some players the day of release. But there was a problem that wasn't immediately apparent for most players. The new reworked Samurais were devoid of any of the tech the old one had. But more than that, they just weren't fun to use, and slowly but quietly, the first chunk of Black Magicians drifted away from the game. Within a month, all the Samurai players would go extinct. Next on the docket was everything else, except Ravager. There were a lot of ideas being shouted around on how to nerf the other keystroke classes because they can play very cheap. So NAZO decided to go through with reworking some classes entirely and making big changes to others to remove that cheap aspect. You might be wondering why I haven't mentioned the main developer Nylium. Well, that's because he just kinda stopped caring about the game, I guess, and went on his own little adventure. So NAZO was the only one in the picture and he got to work. Despite having a real job at the time, NAZO worked hard and squeezed whatever passion he had to make this update happen. And the reworks looked sick, and NAZO was mostly satisfied. So off the update goes, and the player count didn't see the Samurai rework numbers, but it did see 30 or some players. And how do I put this? This was the right update for the wrong people. The keystroke classes were in a way watered down, which was a good thing because they were still interesting, looked better, and played more fair. The game had taken one big step away from being a coin mill game, but the game's player base at the time was made up entirely of loyal players that played every single day. To say people were unhappy would be an understatement. The existing player base liked how the game was, so they obviously left, and ironically, the people who complained the most about serious balance changes and hyped the reworks also abandoned the game, and watching the backlash NAZO received in real time was crazy. They really took him out back and jumped him online. But amidst the fiery end of Blackmagic Unleashed, a new group would emerge, founded by Vampiric, dedicated to the reworked Nightmare class. And it would die right out the gates because Nightmare wasn't a popular class and the game was already on its way out. As for NAZO, thinking he had seen it all, the ops spin back on him. For the crime of updating a dead Roblox game, the ops would expose NAZO's questionable relationship with a girl. And this was the final straw. The harassment had reached its peak and NAZO just packed his bags. And so, Blackmagic is dead. The only dev that worked on the game vanished, and now it was in the hands of Nylium, who is still doing whatever it is that he is doing. So naturally, all of us assume Blackmagic has finally died after 14 years. There's nobody left working on the game and hardly any players. It might be strange to hear this after all I've said, but Blackmagic dying isn't a problem. Despite the game being revived and more polished than ever, nobody returns to it. There's a good reason for that. The game sucks. During the making of this video, I found so much widespread support for Blackmagic 1 all across the internet. The game's influence can be seen everywhere, and it has directly inspired so many things on and off Roblox. So why don't the thousands of inactive players return to the game? Because it sucks. People love the concept of Blackmagic, not the game. As frustrating as it is hearing people whine about nothing new and interesting to play, nobody would recommend playing Blackmagic to anyone, including me. But what we all believe in isn't the game anymore, but the concept. The concept of black magic deserves love, and players still continue to work towards showing the world how valuable that concept is. Maybe a proper sequel to the game, maybe an entirely new game outside of Roblox, or even something completely unrelated that draws ideas from black magic. A lot of us are working towards something that black magic directly inspired. For example, this video, and why I'm so happy you got this far in it. I'm not hoping for people to go rush to play the game and be all excited for a decade-old Roblox game. But me and everyone else want this game to be known, to get the love it never got. And by being here learning about it, you are doing us a huge favor. So all I really ask is you go around and share this video to someone. Even if you don't go around preaching the black magic gospel, I'm glad you're here. There's a lot that couldn't make it into the video, so I will post an entire document in the description with a full interview of huge NAZO, anecdotes, and other cool things that are part of this documentary. And if you want to play black magic yourself, well, it's still open and free to try, so why not? Oh hey, I forgot to thank my patrons. I'm just joking, I don't have any. Don't skip the credits though, all the people who contributed to this video are in it. Links that might be interesting are in the description, so go check them out. Remember to share this video, like, or comment, please. It means a lot to us. Thank you everyone, and see you guys later.